For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And thank you. And I am happy to announce our post-lunch speaker, Jonathan Dandes. He currently serves as corporate vice president of Rich Products Corporation. He also most recently served as president of Rich Baseball Operations. He served as the chairman of the ECMC Corporation Board of Directors from 2017 to 2021, and is also the immediate past chair of the ECMC Foundation. Recently, New York State Governor Kathy Hochul appointed John to his 5th term as a member of the University at Buffalo Council. He is an adjunct associate professor at Niagara University, where he teaches in the College of Tourism and Sports Management, and he has also served as a trustee of the Nichols School. Jonathan, thank you so very much for coming to the Jackson Center.
Our preeminent moment in time at the Robert Jackson Center, which put us on the map, was the arrival of Chief Justice William Rehnquist dedicating this facility. The only condition of Chief Justice Rehnquist agreeing to come here was to be flown in by a private jet. No honorarium, no anything else, just a minor little task that I was asked to perform. And so a well-placed phone call to the guy on my right, Jonathan Dandes, saying help. And the next thing you know, through the graciousness of John and the good folks at Rich Products, that became an availability, which then led to Rehnquist coming here, which then launched the Robert Jackson Center into what it is today. So I want to publicly and on record say how much I really appreciated us, and we at the Jackson Center appreciate you, John, personally.
Well, thank you, Greg. I was telling some of my colleagues that my last time here was at that event, and the conversation with Mr. Rich went something along the lines of, "You want to do what with whom? to go where?" And but it obviously it worked out great, and our pilots still talk about trying to fly I believe we had a Gulfstream 4 at the time, trying to get that onto the Jamestown Airport. With the Chief Justice, whose reason, as I remember, needing the private aircraft was he's a bad back.
That correct?
Well, we took care of that back on that short runway. So, but coming down here, Greg has brought back a slew of memories with you and Mayor Sam Teresi and of course Russell Dietrich, the Dietrich Stadium and the Jammers.
Yep.
So it's great to see Scotty again and see all my pals. We spent some really fun times here. Although I did not remember until coming down here today Route 60 and getting behind the school bus. So any tardiness on my point can be blamed directly on them. But I appreciate the invitation. And Greg, as you all know, Greg has been a force of nature here in this part of the state of New York, period. And this center and the remarkable series of either you would consider them coincidences or providential moments to create this center and recognize Justice Jackson is due to my friend on the left here. So, Greg, for all that you do, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Big hand for this.
I know one of the things, just to set the stage, John is intimately involved in a lot of things in Buffalo, but also the current subject matter is there are congressional hearings been called regarding minor leagues and the status of the minor leagues. We know from today's CLE that minor leagues have been, through Major League Baseball, been permitted to unionize. We know that there's a lot of other movements afoot, which puts into play the antitrust exemption question. And there's nobody who's in the middle of that issue more than Jon Dandes. And so if I could at least set the stage and you could chat a little bit about it before we get into a little Q&A.
Sure. So they say timing is everything. So the fact that we're in the middle of the playoff season now and the ramp up to the World Series is probably a great moment to have this conversation. this whole notion of baseball and antitrust is that, and by the way, I do want to, before I start, a big shout out to Professor Nellie Drew and her students at the University of Buffalo School of Law. Nellie is the preeminent, I would argue, one of the preeminent attorneys and legal scholars in the country relative to sports law and sports management. And the fact that she's in Buffalo and participating is I just think a remarkable point of difference and really spectacular for the Jacksons. That said, the playoffs are starting. People are focused on baseball, despite what's going on with the Buffalo Bills, which is spectacular. But I would argue that we are in and have been for the past year and a half, a very translational, almost generational change in how we view particularly professional baseball. And one could argue that's true of all professional sports, but baseball in particular. And that's because the business model has changed. We often talk about the competitive nature of sports and how cool it is that the Yankees play the Red Sox or the Cubs play the White Sox, and these are points of municipal and public interest. That the Yankees and Mets can talk about a Subway Series up until a couple of nights ago. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, I would ask you to, and this is a generational point as well, go on to TikTok. TikTok over the past 48 hours has been inundated with New York Mets fans losing their collective minds over with some of the funniest, most creative things you could ever possibly imagine. It's followed only closely second by the Toronto Blue Jays and what happened to them the other night. But the Mets stuff is just unbelievable. But having said that, what's happened is a year and a half ago, as a result of 3 years worth of, one would argue, non-negotiation, Major League Baseball and Minor League Baseball came to a new agreement called a collective baseball agreement. And that new agreement set aside 100 years worth of tradition and methodologies and ways of doing business to create what we have now. And as you may know, the minor leagues were reduced from 160 teams to 120. So 40 communities across the country lost their teams. Now one could argue that what replaced them, they didn't really lose them, they just changed format. I would argue that the traditional affiliated baseball, AAA, AA, single A, short A, long A, season model has changed dramatically. It's changed significantly to the point now where all of the minor league teams, the 120 remaining teams, were asked to sign what amounts to a license to have an affiliated team at the AAA, AA, and single A level to produce players. And the rationale for that was basically, from the perspective of Major League Baseball, based on three things. One was player development, and player safety. And that translated into travel. So if you were to look at, let me back up just one bit. If you were to look at your point of reference as the movie Bull Durham, as sort of the quintessential document, if you will, for what minor league baseball, that's about as accurate a depiction of what baseball was all about up until a year and a half ago. Those types of stadiums, that type of travel, those types of relationships with players was really, for the most part, what it was all about. That has dramatically changed, and Major League Baseball insisted, once again, driven by the numbers. You will look at, for example, the top 10 draftees this year. The average signing bonus for just the top 10 in the top 10 rounds was over $1 million. So what the model then became was baseball is spending this extraordinary amount of money on the if-come that players drafted out of college will somehow make it into the big leagues, and you're going to pay them sometimes 8 figures. So the notion of, of Clint Eastwood sitting in a stand, watching whether a guy can hit a curveball or not, is no longer the case. The development of analytics that are used to predict, at least statistically, how players are going to do. And that has changed the force of baseball. So to get back to my point, player safety, we spend a lot of time now talking about player nutrition, the amount of hours that players get to sleep, their rest, their overall conditioning as athletes, and their general sense of being. If you were to tell me 5 years ago, for example, that teams at the AAA level would have full-time nutritionists and in some cases full-time cooks in the clubhouse to be sure that they're not eating cheese doodles and chicken wings, I would have said that's not happening. I will tell you gospel truth is happening in every AAA clubhouse and in most AA clubhouses in the United States. So it was all about the players. Number two, which was really relevant to what happened here in Jamestown, is facilities. And that came about for 2 reasons. The first was, if you look at the amount of money and the investment that major league teams were making in their players, they did not want their players to come into minor league stadiums where the facilities were less than what they'd see in their colleges. A great case in point is our AA team, for example, is in Springdale, Arkansas. The city of Springdale and in the surrounding Northwest Arkansas area will have spent, and we play there currently, we're affiliated with the Kansas City Royals, spent about $65 million to build a new stadium for this ballpark that we share with the community. The University of Arkansas, which is about 7 miles from our stadium, plays in the SEC, spent a little more than that for their intercollegiate program. And so a great case in point is baseball saying we can't have our players playing in those types of buildings. And if you look at the Power 5 conferences, for example, Big Ten, or particularly the Southwestern and the teams in the Southwest and the West where they play baseball 365 days a year, those ballparks are every bit as sophisticated as anything that you would see at the major league level, although with less seats. But the training facilities, the X-ray machines, the medical facilities, the clubhouses are every bit as sophisticated as those. So you put all that together, and baseball said the only teams that we want to be affiliated with that will have the moniker of a major league franchise will be those teams that are willing to, A, expend the money to provide the facilities and to create the travel and the nutrition and the support for players, as well as the facilities. And that created a whole series of changes that minor league baseball was asked to embrace. I would argue that Major League Baseball looks at particularly the NBA, the National Basketball Association, and the National Football League as a model. Neither one of them, and of course you could argue that the National Football League, is the preeminent professional sports league in the world. And some of my European colleagues will talk about soccer, in Europe. I would still argue that when one looks at the, some of the easy metrics, the number of people watching TV over the year, the top 5 are still the last 5 Super Bowls. The next 5 are the divisional playoff games. And then comes Dynasty and Game of Thrones and and all the rest of them. So from a public perception and from a public acceptance perspective, it is all about what what the business model will accept in terms of revenue and expenses. Because at the end of the day, it gets back, talk my way back into the antitrust. Professional sports, unless you think anything other than it is very, very big business. And the salaries dictate that. The sophistication with which the games are presented speaks to that. And the fact that you can go onto your local cable station or your satellite station and find out that the NBA has its own network. The NFL has its own network for years. The MLB network has had its own network, and I would argue the sophistication of its programming is every bit as sophisticated as NBC, CBS, and ABC, much less any of the other cable channels. And why is that? That's because you all are watching. Because the general public has said, this is what we demand. And what advertisers have figured out is if they want to get that audience, whether they're selling cars or insurance or cell phones or soda or anything else, that's where the audience is. And that's what has created this new metric, if you will. And antitrust, to that degree, has become, one could argue, passé, because baseball, and certainly, while not necessarily governed by it, the notion that these businesses operate with, or baseball operates with this, with exemption, sort of belies the fact. And I think you'll see more and more of that generating lots of conversation. Up to, was it a month ago, minor league baseball players became unionized with the acceptance of Major League Baseball. Baseball commissioner came out and said, yeah, we're going to do this. And so minor league baseball players are now in the process now of organizing and being unionized. So the notion, like Crash Davis, working for $1,000 a month and hoping to get to the big leagues is really not true anymore. Most of the guys that reach that level of performance and reach that level of contract within baseball are significantly paid and hoping for the really big payday. I don't know if you were watching any of the games over the weekend, almost as big as the stories were of the Mets losing, for example, and the Yankees winning, was the notion of where's Aaron Judge going next year? That, my guess would be, if you look at the number of inches printed or airtime spent on that conjecture, there was much discussion about that as there was about who the Yankees are going to play. That was certainly true of the Mets, with who's going to be here. And what does that mean? Was Scherzer worth $45 million or whatever they paid him? And how many of those Mets are coming back? And what's the number going to be? And the numbers are astronomical, particularly what they were relatively recently. We're talking about 3 to 5 years. Our agreement with minor league baseball is going to be 2 years old. So it's very much a dynamic, and so it's changing. Mm-hmm. And so it leaves places like Jamestown, in a place where, and the guys I think are doing a great job, with what they have. And the realization, though, that it's being driven by facilities, and what the player commitment is all about is really become the priority.
What's this all meant to the Buffalo Bisons? I mean, you are part of the minor league structure. You are affiliated with the Toronto Blue Jays. You now have this new agreement on a day-to-day basis. What's that really mean to you?
Well, it's been significant, and I give my all the credit to my colleagues Mike Buczkowski and Anthony Sprague, who are managing the Bisons and Rich Baseball, right now. The metric has changed. So, for example, the use of our building requires where Mike and I and Anthony could 5 years ago or 4 years ago or 3 years ago make a decision as to a concert or a non-game day event, we could make that decision, and if the numbers made sense and it made sense for the community, we'd go ahead and do it. Now we have an added step. We need to request permission from Major League Baseball, and that's sometimes that's an issue. They work really hard to work cooperatively, and I'm happy to tell you that they're working and trying to make it as positive an experience as possible. But that's in a day-to-day sense. There's Major League Baseball has become very much of a partner in minor league baseball, which they were always obviously part of it because they paid all the players, in forever, and the manager and the coaches. So they were never outside of minor league baseball. They were very much funding it. But the management of the team and what we did in ballparks was something that every local team did. Without regard to what Major League Baseball, obviously, there would be nothing that we do to damage the field or damage the reputation. I mean, one of the interesting things, I find fascinating now, and this is probably a year old, it was not all that long ago where we could not, whether it would be in Jamestown or Springdale, Arkansas, or Wichita, Kansas, or Buffalo, New York, where we couldn't accept a promotional deal, a promotional support from the New York State Lottery. New York State couldn't accept it because it was gaming. And now every other commercial that you read about is either FanDuel or the other one. Yeah, and it's that tells you, once again, my poster child for how things have changed. 5 years ago, you couldn't even talk about a lottery, and now we're talking about, you can bet 2 to 1 on whether Aaron Judge is going to get a pitch outside or he's going to get thrown a strike down the middle by the pitch. That's different.
So tell me about, just we're going to segue a little bit, or perhaps a little bit, just a flash, because you had an experience like no other franchise, where in fact you, because of your relationship with Toronto, because of the pandemic, all of a sudden Toronto Blue Jays was the major league team cited for the very first time since, I need Joe Overfield to help me, but way back when, in Buffalo. What was that experience like from your perspective? I mean, you're not even a tenant in the building, you're just sort of an observer.
It was a fascinating experience, and once again, I can't say enough about the work that Mike Buczkowski and Anthony did in the day-to-day management of that whole process. But they say things happen because they're supposed to happen. The overriding motivation between all of this, and of course the pandemic was going on, but we were in a very interesting position right from the get-go, which was driven by the fact that the president of the Blue Jays, Mark Shapiro, had been the Bison's, director of player personnel and farm director for the Cleveland Indians.
Yeah.
We were with them for 10 years. So we, we had a relationship with Mark and Ross Atkins right from the get-go that we would not have had. Thanks, Sharon. That we would not have had. So it made the that would have made the conversation easy. And so when the pandemic started, and we knew baseball was going to be in trouble, and the Prime Minister Trudeau said he was going to close the borders, the notion that every visiting team would have to be both quarantined and then vaccinated every time they came to Toronto to play was a non-starter, both with the union and with Major League Baseball. So they started to look at options. They started to look at options. One of the options was to stay in Florida, and just play in their spring training facility, which is interesting given what's happened a month ago. But if you've been to Florida in the summer, you know what that's like. And they would have played in their spring training facility, which is a great spring training facility, but that's what it is. And so, the fateful call came, which was, what if? And the what if led to a series of meetings that said, and this happened over really 2 years, because if you remember, we played much of the season in a revised, and Mark and Ross did a tremendous job. They spent a ton of money changing everything from the clubhouse to the infield to the lighting in our ballpark, Coca-Cola Salient Field, excuse me. And I was about ready to say Duntire Park.
I was ready to say pilot, so I just didn't know where I am.
We're dating ourselves. And then they came in. It was like the 82nd Airborne, and the Toronto Blue Jays staff arrived, and once again it was fortuitous because about half the roster of the Major League Toronto Blue Jays team had played in Buffalo, and so there was a natural affinity for many of the players who enjoy. And one of the things I think the Bisons have done categorically over the past 35 years has been, to create a real good sense. We travel to All-Star games now and World Series and playoffs games, and see, so many of our players still talk with great fondness of their time in Buffalo, or in Jamestown, and any number of them ended up with families here. Any number of them are still here, and so it was easy to make the case for the players to say, okay, well, we're going to come to Buffalo, what they thought was for a short time. And then, of course, it turned out to be some part of 2 seasons. But it was, we basically said to the Blue Jays, okay, tell us what you need. Here are the keys. And, our staff, worked tirelessly to create a major league environment, for our fans. And for that brief moment in time, it was the New York Yankees playing here, and the Houston Astros playing here, and Tampa, and that is, I know Greg someplace in his litany and library of videos has got some video that will appear 30 years from now somewhere, with that great moment in time. But it was, as I say, it was done with military-like precision, which is, we got this, guys. We'll take it from here, and our guys worked very tirelessly with them to help make it happen.
So when the day is done, they now they're obviously playing back in Toronto. Did they leave some stuff behind?
They left some time. They left a whole lot of baseball shoes. I've never, as you may know, one of the remarkable things for me, and I've been around this now for a long time, in multiple franchises, but it never ceases to amaze me walking into a major league clubhouse, because all of the players have shoe contracts, and to see some of the players with 25 pairs of shoes. So they left lots of shoes, but to their credit, they left a new field, new infield, new outfield, new lighting, new clubhouses, which are spectacular. I invite you all up to, and Anthony will be happy to give you a group rate to sell tickets for opening day. And
Good, it's good. You can put in for mileage now.
exactly. And but they left some major league elements to our minor league ballpark, to the point where we can say, with no hubris or no arrogance, our AAA ballpark, is in many ways, in some areas, as nice as a major league ballpark, because it was and is, and that's because of the Blue Jays, and they deserve credit for that.
You lived through the negotiation phase when the Major League Baseball sort of announced. I know you announced the fact there's a new agreement between minor league baseball and Major League Baseball, but it really was an unfair negotiation. And I suspect you were somewhat in the middle of that. Could you give us a tenor of how that conversation went? I know the president at the time, I think it was Johnson, was kind of overwhelmed by the whole thing.
I'm going to be circumspect about the answer to that question.
Okay, why not?
At the time, I was the president of the New York Penn League, was chairman of the board of the New York Penn League, and I also chaired the executive committee for the Texas League. And of course, Morgantown was, first Jamestown, Morgantown was played in the New York Penn League for many years. And our Springdale franchise was, Northwest Arkansas was in the Texas League. And which got us into the Staten Island. I understand you've already talked about that. So we were in the middle of all that, and quite clearly, Major League Baseball, using those tenets of what they were looking to do, was very insistent that the give and take was mostly give. And the reality was, or is, that the benefit to the remaining affiliated teams was the affiliation. The teams that remain, are in fact tied tightly by contract over the next 10 years with their major league affiliate, and that makes that's the difference between independent baseball, right? So our players, and we can talk about how many players end up, in the big leagues from that, and then at the end of the day, that's what all of this is all about, right? This is all about getting players to play at the highest level in the world. The players that you're going to see in the next couple of weeks, irrespective of how their teams did in the playoff rounds, are legitimately the best players in the world. I would argue, and over the years, Greg, and I'm sure you've had similar calls, people say, gee, my son is a great high school player, or his little league coach thinks he's, those players are scouted from the time they're 12. And I say that, people say, that's not true. That is absolutely true, right? Every major league team has got a network of scouts whose sole job is to identify those players gifted and talented enough to play at the very highest level. And so they are identified. They're identified in youth baseball. They are identified. Well, look at the Little League World Series, or you look at the ESPN ratings, and those Little League games at 12-year-olds, are rated as high as anything on TV. Well, who's watching them? Scouts. And they will follow those players through college or through wherever they're going to play next, and they will end up in some war room someplace in a major league stadium on a blackboard. And someone is going to make the decision to say, we're going to pay this kid whatever they're going to pay him, because we believe, based on the metrics, based on bat speed and speed home to first and launch angle and all those new sets of metrics, that this kid can end up in Dodger Stadium or Progressive Field or Citi Field, in the bottom of the ninth, trying to hit a home run or strike the side out, and be paid $45 million a year. So at the end of the day, it's about the players, and this business model that the public has created, because at the end of the day, if you weren't watching on TV or buying those products or showing up at the ballpark or the stadium, it wouldn't be happening, but it is.
Yeah.
Or watching on networks.
By the way, your son was quite the ball player. Did you get a sense of seeing that just right at home with your son?
Well, my son Leo, who is was a student of Nellie's, a graduate of the law school, played Division I, and is continues to coach at the AAA BA level, and what we saw even at the intercollegiate level, the notion that student athletes, and you can't talk about intercollegiate athletics now without talking about the conversation about unions. Mm-hmm. Particularly on the football side, what they call revenue producing sports. With college football players being unionized and getting paid for promotional work. I still am amazed. My son did his undergraduate work at St. Peter's University in Jersey City. right? St. Peter's Peacocks, right? Final Four,
Yeah.
basketball. Okay, they went to what the last four, or last eight? Last eight. They're getting ready to start their season. Last year's team, the coach, gone. And I think they've got 2 players coming back. Of their entire team. Most of their team has gone on to the higher level classifications without, it used to be, a couple of years ago, we had to sit out a year. Not anymore. And some of them signed for pretty lucrative sponsorship contracts. These are 19-year-old kids. 19-year-old men who are going to make an awful lot of money playing basketball when the definition of what they're doing, what used to be student athlete. I would argue that the student part of that is sometimes suspect.
Yeah.
And I don't say that critically, by the way. I don't say that critically. You know, if you have the opportunity to sit in sociology 101 with 300 other people or 20 people versus go out and play in a 6,000 seat stadium that is packed and have a shoe contract or a pop contract or or some sponsorship deal that's going to bring you and your family $1 million, that's an easy one. You know, go back and get your degree 3 years from now. And a lot of guys do that, by the way. So, you know, it's a changing environment.
Speaking of changing environment, I'm just curious, as you were the chairman of the New York Penn League, and that league just imploded. I mean, it's gone.
Yes.
And at some point, there had to have been a meeting where you're chairing via Zoom, where kind of it became, despite feelings to the contrary, it happened. I mean, you kind of announced the fact there is no negotiation. We're gone.
Well, I mean, there was a negotiation, and we said yes. But the reality was most of the teams in the New York Penn League, not all of them, maintain some type of relationship. Not all of them are out of baseball. You know, some of them went to the independent league, some of them went to the other leagues, the rookie leagues. So most of them are in fact still playing, but that moniker is vastly different.
Yeah. Staten Island took it upon themselves, saying enough, and went after it, and they're now working itself through the court system. And our Professor Brad Snyder from Georgetown, that's how we concluded his event. Was talking about the Staten Island case, and if there was ever a case which ultimately finds its way, if they grant certiorari on that, that's the one which will probably take, not the Toulson case, any antitrust exemption, to task. I asked the question, and I don't know the answer, and is what happens if? So what? So what if baseball loses its antitrust exemption, which is an aberration? Everybody knows that. It's sort of it's hanging out there. Do you get any sense that it would make a difference in your world?
Well, first I would answer the question in a couple ways. Number one, this notion of antitrust has been a conversation. In fact, in anticipation of being here, I Googled it, and I would ask you to do the same. Just Google baseball antitrust. There are pages and pages and pages in cyberspace about opining about all of this. So I have no illusion about what's going to happen. What I will speak to is what the practical implications are, and that is that baseball will continue to drive the model of financial success about and whether it's competitive or not, or what that means in terms of being able to negotiate contracts with the players union and now the minor league players union is all very much in flux. And as Greg used to say to me when we were here in Jamestown, that's a situation in litigation, so I won't comment on it. No, but in all seriousness, I think it's very much in flux, and I wouldn't hazard a guess as to where it ends up, other than to say that so long as people continue And this is what, they talk about the magic of October. And, we go through the season, just what we saw last weekend, and what we're about to see as the playoffs continue in the World Series. We may find that, one of the metrics is how many people are actually watching on TV, for example. And while that may be down, it's not down enough to change much, because people are still in love with baseball. I would argue that it's still baseball's pastime. And we'd get into an argument with some of my football colleagues. There's no question that the NFL has done a spectacular job in promoting its product and what it does. I mean, think about it. The NFL draft meetings, are now televised, as are MLB. I mean, is that worthy of a TV broadcast? Well, apparently it is, because people watch it.
Yeah.
And let me assure you, if people weren't watching it, it wouldn't be there. So the truth, Bob Rich told me, and Bob Rich Sr. Said to us a long time ago, he said, people vote with their feet, right? They show up. And if they don't show up, that's all you need to know about your product and your marketing. Well, I would argue that people are still showing up.
Yeah.
And the fact, once again, anecdotally, you go onto TikTok, which, by the way, and my millennial daughter told me this the other day, TikTok is now the #1 social media platform in the country. It is now more popular than Facebook, than Instagram, than Twitter, than all the rest of them, TikTok. And the fact that TikTok has now been consumed over these past 2 days with what's been going on in baseball tells you what you need to know about what the state of the universe is.
You're going to bring up that Mets thing again, aren't you? John,
saying.
you okay, John?
Just saying. And of course, that we were a Mets affiliate for 5 years. So, so I will tell you anecdotally, one of our best friends in baseball, certainly, and maybe the world, is Terry Collins, who was our manager in baseball for many years, and was obviously the manager of the Mets the last time they went to they went deep into the playoffs in the World Series. And so he and I were on the phone in that last game, and the thought that that team could now be, you talk about antitrust, now be dismantled because of the free agency and the ability of players, now to move to the highest bidder, is going to be significant. Yeah. And what that does now, the new owner, Steve Cohen, the new owner of the Mets, is not without his means. So I'm sure they're not going to, they're going to do everything they can to maintain their posture. But that's going to be, you watch that one, that's going to be fun to see what happens.
Speaking about fun to make things happen, we, as you mentioned, the Jamestown Community Baseball, I'm going to give you a book when we're done here about the history of us down here, which brings us up to the Jamestown Community Baseball, Tarp Skunks, and Niagara's part of that. And you're part of instructing Niagara. What's your sense of the Perfect Game Collegiate Baseball League, of which we're a part and Niagara's a part?
Well, I think it's great. It's a great outlet for players to do their thing. I mean, it allows players the exposure to continue to play at that level, and it's certainly very competitive level. And you just never know. You just never know when that one player who might have been overlooked by that scout, or who went to a smaller school and would not have gotten the notoriety that you'd get in Tulsa or USC or Florida or Miami, ends up in Yankee Stadium or Citi Field or Progressive Field. And so I'm all for it. And I know it's true in Jamestown. I know it's true in Niagara. They get nice crowds. Mm-hmm. And it's a place for the community to center around. So, it's something that I and we fully support and wish nothing but the best and hope that it all works out. I think, everybody's got to find their space, because the numbers are not insignificant. It's not for the faint of heart.
Exactly. So when you're in Nellie's class, and I know they're watching, and some very bright law student raises his hand during the Q&A and says, has a question for the Jon Dandes, what would that question be that we haven't talked about?
It's usually, how do I go to work for Scott Boras? That's the question I hear most. And for those of you who don't know, Scott Boras is probably, and this is arguable, but I would argue, the preeminent sports agent, maybe in the world. Representing not just baseball, but any number of athletes. And so many of the law students that I come into contact with, have a desire to get into sports law because and it's not just the player agent piece of it. It's sports law as it relates to contracts and liability and antitrust and anything that you would find in a general counsel's office. I mean, Major League Baseball, whose offices are in Park Avenue, is populated by any number of attorneys who are hired to be sure that the licenses are adhered to properly, that the agreements that are all governed by contract are adhered to, and that they're executed properly. So the sports management business continues to grow and requires, I will tell you, requires a legal background and maybe even more so an accounting background. Because the numbers have become so prolific, one could argue that the need for an accounting degree and or CPA is really what's required if you're going to work professionally within the sports business, because particularly at the highest level in the major league or the NFL or NBA, that so much of our decision making on a daily basis is, okay, what did legal say? So there's lots of work out there.
Absolutely. Just a personal sidebar, because we're going to draw a closure here, but it was this guy here who sent myself and then current general manager Mike Bellani to Washington when the last antitrust issues under Representative Henry Hyde was happening. And so I became a bag boy, and my bag...
Hardly.
And so what I carried around, I got to tell you just a brief story, because our uniforms, my bag, going into Congress. I mean, we could walk our way into Moynihan's office. We could walk our way into D'Amato's office, just walk. And I had a bag, and each one was presented with a Buffalo Bison's jersey with their names on the back, and my job was to take the picture, hand that, and take the picture. And ultimately, that trip was very, very beneficial because it died. I mean, that whole it was Henry Hyde. I think it was Representative Hyde.
And Chuck Schumer still talks about that, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes, he does.
So thanks to them, I had a trip to Washington, D.C. But I got to tell you, just as we do draw a closure, when you pick up a Buffalo Bison's program and you go back even 1988, which was year one at Pilot Field, and you go back before that, you'll see Jon Dandes. See Jon Dandes. And he has a
year I thought I was going to tell everybody I was 35.
Yeah. But, there is a continuum of sports and rich products involvement, Bob Sr., Bob Jr., but Jon Dandes, often the guy, the Oz behind the curtain, but that continuum and the consistency of that franchise and other franchises, including a wonderful 19 years here. I mean, we down here have nothing but the highest respect and praise for what you did for us here. And I know it's sometimes you had to swallow hard, but we appreciated all of that. And
thank you for that. But I think it needs to be said, none of that would have been possible without the hands-on, direct support and motivation by the Rich family. And that's Bob Rich Sr., may rest in peace, and certainly Bob Jr. and Mindy and the next generation. The Rich family, through all of our sports franchise, have been very much hands-on and very direct and involved in everything that we've done on the sports side. And I still tell people to this day, that Bob during the season, that Bob and Mindy, wherever they are in the world, have an iPad that somehow gets all three of our team's games on at the same time, so that he and Mindy are watching the games in real time on their iPads, and sometimes I would get calls and I wouldn't necessarily be. I might be eating a hot dog or not paying real attention, and Bob would call and say, "I just saw that didn't look like a strike. Was it a strike?" And I'd say, "I don't know." Like, what do you mean you don't know? Aren't you at the game? Yes, I am, but I was eating a hot dog. But
What the hell are you doing?
but exactly. But to Greg's point, none of this would have been possible, either Jamestown or Buffalo or anywhere else, without Bob and Mindy,
Sure,
and certainly Bob Rich Sr. before that.
Just out of curiosity, how did you get involved in this? I mean, here you are, sports. I mean, you're involved in so many things now in Buffalo, but clearly there was a thread of sports throughout there.
Well, it was a long, circuitous route. I'll cut to. So I had just started working for Rich Products a long time ago, and I was I'd gone to my background was in food service, and I had joined Rich Products as a product manager for our barbecue line, and how that happened was another story. But Bob called one day and said, "Listen, I just talked to Jimmy Griffin, who was the mayor of Buffalo at the time. We're buying the Buffalo Bisons, and much like the airplane story, I said, 'You talked to who and you're going to do what?' And he said, 'Yeah, I just talked to the mayor. We're buying the franchise, and we need to look at the food service side, and so we're going to change up your responsibilities, and come see me.'" And that was it.
The rest is history.
The rest is history.
And it continues, and it continues. Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Dandes.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Greg.
That's yours?
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great. Here, have a couple of, this is for your Baseball Hall of Fame. Scotty, there he is, John.
Scotty, I'm going to give one of these to Mike Bellani. This is great.